Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of our podcast mini-series Getting to Better Together, which is sponsored by the Centre for International Development, Social Entrepreneurship and Leadership at the University of the Sunshine Coast and is supported by Noosa Radio FM 101.3, and I'm your host Richard Bawden. Before proceeding further, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Whenever I say these words, I reflect on what it is that we've seemingly lost in our insatiable quest for what we regard as progress. In our ever-continuing thrust to be an industrialised modern state, our focus has been on exploitation of the land rather than on custodianship of it. We've ruptured our innate intimate relationships with the rest of nature and, I suggest, all too often with each other. Neighbour with neighbour, local community with local community, political faction with political faction, and nation with nation. And if we can't seem to get on with and respect each other, how can we expect to get on with and respect the environment about us? Perhaps there's simply too many of us, too many to be friends with each other, too remote from others to be concerned with their well-being, too focused on self rather than on community, or beyond, on nature itself. Maybe there are just too many of us. One day, within the next few months, there will be 8 billion of us humans on this planet, clustered across nearly 200 different nations of vastly different scales, hugely different geographies, and immensely different cultural and economic conditions. But we'll all be hustling and bustling away to survive in a world that's beset by uncertainties and complex social, economic, cultural, and ecological challenges. So who cares? Who does care? Who can help us in these hours of our need? Who, on a truly global scale, are committed to getting to better together? Luckily for us, and thanks to the wisdom and foresight of some of our elders, who established first the League of Nations after World War I and the United Nations after World War II, we do have institutions in place that are proving to be of immeasurable value in helping us overcome some of our limitations. And these institutions are populated by some of the most caring people on Earth, tens of thousands of them. My guest today, Mike Sackett, was one of these dedicated carers for more than 2 decades, working in increasingly senior positions within the United Nations, and particularly within the World Food Programme, and in the latter part of his career in humanitarian initiatives, all mostly within Africa and Asia. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much, Richard.
When I say that the UN is filled with caring people, is that true?
Probably not. There's a whole spectrum, as you'd expect. I've certainly met and worked with some remarkably caring and capable human beings, but I would be wrong to pretend the 100% of that population was of that ilk.
What draws people to want to work with the United Nations?
I think it's a variety of things. I mean, quite clearly, it's people who are happy to work outside their comfort zone, to work in differing environments. In fact, to even be stimulated and to thrive in various backgrounds and working with a variety of people. I think they are some of the hallmarks of successful UN employees.
Over your long decades of working in various countries of the world in various projects, have you come to have a clear understanding of, if I asked you, what do you mean by development? Could you answer that in a concise term?
Well, a lot of things come under the heading of development, but I think you can almost boil it down to good governance, good education, and good health. Okay. To keep at a very simple level, that's what I'd say, yeah.
Right. So if I said, as our theme of this particular podcast series is getting to better, you would have not much difficulty in understanding where the better lay.
Certainly the direction of betterness, I think, is quite straightforward. And especially when you see in so many different situations, either abject poverty or discrimination against women, lack of education, children dying needlessly, not vaccinated and so on. Yes, it's very simple, I think, to see the path to betterment.
In shifting to let me rephrase that in terms of taking up within the World Food Programme. That clearly does have a very clear idea of what betterment is about.
It does, and it's interesting. World Food Programme has been in existence for 60 years now. It started as an organisation dealing with food surpluses, and it used it almost exclusively on development projects. However, World Food Programme today has almost totally switched to an emphasis on emergency life-saving activities. And sadly, very often this is in the aftermath of conflict. Even today, a country like Ukraine is probably the most recent recipient of WFP assistance.
And what does assistance mean in that context?
Basically, food to keep people alive.
Okay.
And it is a most basic ration of food. It's calories, usually in the form of cereals. It's protein in the form of legumes, certainly not meat or fish. And it's vegetable oil, which is a dense form of calories and adds to the palatability of the food people eat.
Right. So there's a sort of double whammy in the Ukraine, isn't there, where people themselves are going to go hungry in a grain bowl.
Exactly, yes. I mean, it's one of the major food surplus countries of the world, wheat being the main crop. A lot of that wheat ends up in the Middle East. I'm particularly worried about a country like Egypt, with 100 million people, a wheat-eating country. Their primary supplies of wheat came from the Black Sea across the Mediterranean into Egypt, and those food flows will not continue to anything like the same degree this year.
So what will happen?
That's a very good question. I think clearly there are other sources of supply, but prices will be a lot higher, and inevitably it'll be the people at the bottom of the economic heap who are most affected. So there will be a great deal of additional suffering in Middle Eastern and other countries.
I mean, it always sounds horrible to talk about it, but does this mean actually an advantage to Australian farmers?
Yes, it's certainly. Australia's in the very happy position of going through a third very good year climatically, and this will coincide with a period of very high prices. So for Australian farmers, they certainly are winners.
The World Food Programme itself is not an agency, is it?
It's one of the so-called funds and programs of the UN.
Okay.
And I think the true significance of this is that it gets its resources, it gets its funds through voluntary contributions, primarily from governments. Mm-hmm. Small amount comes from the private sector, but they are government contributions. Australia ranks at about number 13, largest donor. Australia gives money. World Food Programme then uses that money to buy the cheapest forms of wholesome food that it requires. But the key thing is, unlike the political and technical arms of the UN, these resources are provided by Australia on a voluntary basis, not as an assessed contribution.
Right. There are a number, of course, of agencies, aren't there?
Yeah, something like 40, 42.
Wow. And they have clear mandates, or do they overlap with each other?
There is some overlap, but I mean, I think the classic one that helps one sort of understand the role of a multilateral agency is the International Civil Aviation Organization, who play a regulatory role with flying around the world. There's UNICEF, the Children's Fund. There's World Health Organization that, of course, has been very much in the headlines with the recent COVID pandemic. So while there are overlaps between UN agencies, there is each has its own clear area to work within.
And is there any sense of coordination of all of this? I mean, there's a general council.
Yes, so at the central level, there is the UN General Assembly, which has 193 member states. And then there is the Security Council, which is, if you like, is the central governing body. It comprises 15 nations, 5 of which permanent members of the Security Council, and the other 10 have revolving 3-year terms. And Australia was a member of the Security Council up until about 2017, I think it was.
Okay. Let's talk about some of your own personal experiences. Why did you want to join it in the first place? It being the UN.
Yes, that's interesting. I'd always, having qualified in agriculture, wanted to work in an overseas environment. And I started off as a volunteer in Vanuatu, and then I worked for the Australian government in what was pre-independent Papua New Guinea. I stayed on for a further 3 years after independence. And then I was looking to continue in this field, and it seemed to me that the UN system offered probably the greatest range of activities. None of this was pre-planned. One job led to another, but looking back with hindsight, I just think I was incredibly fortunate to have such a stimulating, and most of the time it was fun. Sometimes it was not fun, but I always say it was great having fun and being paid for it.
You've been in some extraordinarily complex situations. When I think about what, for instance, you were telling me earlier about the situation in Afghanistan, when you were there and all of a sudden the world broke loose.
Well, when I arrived there as the representative of the World Food Programme in 1999, it was Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, and we certainly found a means, a modality of working there. The Taliban were smart enough to realise that they needed World Food Programme assistance. They didn't like some of the things we insisted on. We had female employees, etc. But we certainly found a way of, meeting the needs of very desperate, hungry people and working within the parameters or the constraints imposed by the then Taliban regime. Then, of course, 9/11 came on, and the Taliban were, as it turns out, temporarily displaced, but there was certainly a much more open, liberal era of 20 years in Afghanistan, and so I was working there at the beginning of that. And it's interesting, people say, well, of the countries you've worked in, which was your favourite? And I always say Afghanistan.
Oh, really?
And I, for 3 reasons. First of all, the extraordinary people, extraordinary beauty to the country with the high mountains of the Hindu Kush, very arid, very sophisticated and very centuries-old irrigation systems, so dramatically green. And then the sheer history. Again, I have a recollection shortly after arriving in Kandahar of a wizened Afghan pointing to the east and saying, do you know Alexander the Great walked through that gap in the mountains in 329 BC?
Yeah, wow.
Quite extraordinary.
When you change from one country to another, and in your case also from one continent to another, what do you tell yourself when you enter into a new community, a new society, in terms of how am I going to deal with a community, with a society, with a culture that is really significantly different, not necessarily, not from your own culture, but also from the one you've just been in. So you have to do this sort of cultural shift.
It very much so. I guess it's something you become sort of habituated to. And it's part of the stimulus and the positivity about the whole thing. You know, you have some things are the same. The working tenets of working for the World Food Programme were the same whether you were in Afghanistan or Zimbabwe, but the context is dramatically different. One of the key things one does in getting to a new country, you're working in partnership with the host government. Mm-hmm. And each government is unique, and so it's really latching on to those differences, understanding the key things, and you simply have just an enormous learning curve in the first days, weeks, months, and it's at least a year before you can feel any degree of comfort working in a new environment, I found.
There must be those that fall by the wayside.
Actually, remarkably few. I can recall one colleague who joined us on a FAO project. This was in Tanzania, where the economy was in extremely bad shape, almost no consumer goods in shops and so on. And this guy arrived on a Tuesday or whatever it was, and was on the plane back home by the Friday. Wow. He'd had enough. But he was absolutely almost the exception in many years of this.
Someone walks up to you and says, "Tell me in one sentence what the UN does."
Impossible.
What it tries to do? Or?
Yeah. The most basic premise of the UN is keeping the peace. Yeah. And you only have to reflect on what's going on in Ukraine today to realise how badly it's failing. Let me just say a little bit. When I returned to Australia after working 27 years in the UN, I was very struck by two things. One was how little the average Australian knows about the UN, and secondly, what little they did know was extremely negative. Yeah. And I always found that was pretty unfair. Yes, the UN has weaknesses. It's far from a universal force for good, but it has done good things. It has, for example, eradicated polio. Yeah. If we look at what it's managing, or rather not managing to do in terms of keeping peace in a country like Ukraine, you only have to look at the way it's structured. Post Second World War, when it was set up, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so that's Britain, France, US, China and Russia, were given the power of veto. And that may have been sensible at the time, but I can't help thinking that it really negates any possibility of, for example, having a satisfactory outcome to the current situation in Ukraine. Mm. So there will have to be a process of really significant UN reform, although how that can actually come about without the whole apparatus unwinding, sadly, I do not know.
We've talked a fair bit in this series about the Sustainability Development Goals. How have they diffused through the various different agencies? Is it still just one specific group working with it, or is it now a sort of general philosophy? That's really what we should...
Yeah, no, I think you'd find each agency would relate to one or several of the development goals. Right. And yes, I think that does move in a generally helpful direction.
Right. It's just really impossible to conceive if you have no idea of how it all operates, of this massive bureaucracy, which is really what it is, isn't it? I mean, it has people working on the ground. I mean, I was privileged enough to work with FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization within the United Nations, way back in the 70s. And it was an absolute eye-opener for me as a young academic to be invited to join for a brief while, anyway, for 2 years with the United Nations project and trying to grasp the enormity of all of that and how on earth it did do good and how that was then conveyed back to people who mattered in terms of making decisions about let's support what's good.
Well, I think what's important is to understand a little bit about how these organisations are governed. And let me refer to World Food Programme. So it has a governing body of 36 of the member states of the UN are on the governing body of World Food Programme. And that is split between 12 so-called developed countries and 24 less developed, or essentially recipient countries. And there is then a balancing between the different regional parts of the world, so many South American, so many Asian countries, etc. And that governing body very much sets the sort of strategic tone and direction of WFP, and I'm sure it's similar with World Health Organization, UNESCO, etc.
That's just been delightful. Time has flown. Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. Let me end with an anecdote which sort of sums up the issue of general ignorance about what the UN does. Some of my work when I was in Uruguay involved moving sheep from the north of the country to the south. And we, i.e. the United Nations, had said that when you're moving animals from one part of the country to another, you need to have a certificate to move the animals, whatever. And we hadn't brought that into bear. And one night I was coming home late with one of my colleagues, and there was a guy standing in the middle of the road with a sword. And he stopped our truck and said, "Where are you going?" And we had these 4 sheep in the back. And we said we were going back to the laboratory. And he said, "Where's your license for carrying the sheep?" I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know where it was." Anyway, we searched in the car and we couldn't find it. This is the United Nations car, the white car with the big blue blazons on the other side. And he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "From the United Nations." And he said, "United Nations of where?" And I thought, this could be trouble. Mike, thanks so much for coming.
My pleasure.
Just terrific.
Thank you, Richard.